No other movie genre has to fight to prove its own legitimacy quite like horror. For example, you need look no further than how routinely horror is snubbed by major awards institutions like the Oscars, with just a few rare exceptions. No filmmaking discipline is underestimated in the horror genre more than acting, with many still holding outdated beliefs that horror simply offers actors less opportunities than, well, just about any other type of movie. But the annals of horror history prove this categorically wrong. And while we've all screamed from the rooftops about Toni Collette's astounding work in Hereditary, Lupita Nyong'o in Us, and Essie Davis in The Babadook, to name just a few, what about those excellent horror performances that have been largely overlooked? I'm Ellie for What Culture, and here are the 10 most underrated horror movie performances. Number 10. Jackie Earle Haley, A Nightmare on Elm Street, 2010. It's fair to say that very few horror fans were excited about the prospect of a Nightmare on Elm Street remake at all, let alone one which sought to replace the great Robert Englund in the role of iconic serial killer Freddy Krueger. Freddy is part of the Mount Rushmore of horror movie villains, and that's in large part due to Englund's inimitable work in the role. And so, many simply weren't prepared to entertain the prospect of another actor playing the Krueger part. That said, if you put all the hand-wringing aside, Jackie Earle Haley did a fantastic job of giving fans a totally different version of Freddy. Less playful than the quasi-parody that Englund's version had become, and more skin-crawlingly grotesque. Now, Haley's performance is always going to be hindered by the generally tawdry quality of the Elm Street remake, but he's pretty much the only worthwhile aspect of the movie, and acquits himself admirably in an extremely challenging role. Jackie Earle Haley absolutely deserves to get his flowers for that. Number 9. Megan Fox, Jennifer's Body. When Jennifer's Body was released in 2009, it was largely dismissed by critics and audiences alike as a lowbrow horror comedy that satisfied neither as horror nor comedy. Yet this fiercely feminist genre offering has enjoyed something of a re-evaluation in recent years post-Me Too. And to the same token, so should Megan Fox's central performance as a demonically possessed high schooler. At the time of Jennifer's Body's release, it was often opined that Fox was simply leaning into the hypersexualized eye candy roles that she was so typically cast to play. Even if Jennifer's entire character arc is really a subversion of this, given that her abuse at the hands of men results in her transformation into a murderous succubus. Fox obviously nails the superficial allure of her character, but also goes further to capture both the terror and underlying sadness of Jennifer's predicament, factors that were largely ignored by most in 2009. Number 8. James Caan, Misery. Misery is of course best remembered for Kathy Bates' unforgettable Oscar-winning performance as murderously obsessive fan Annie Wilkes. And Bates' work proved impactful enough that it basically left no oxygen behind for her also fantastic co-star James Caan. Though Bates obviously has the meatier of the two parts, she would have had a much tougher time without Caan, who is perfectly cast against type as bedridden author Paul Sheldon, shedding his tough guy image to portray an extremely vulnerable man who slowly comes to realize just how dire his predicament truly is. It's a subtle yet vital counterpoint to Bates's much bigger performance, selling the abject paralytic fear that Paul feels in Annie's presence, and his increasing desperation to free himself from this horrific scenario. Understated performances are often left underappreciated, especially when paired with ones that are categorically swinging for the fences, and there are few better examples than this. The next time you rewatch Misery, try and focus on all the sly choices that James Caan is making. I promise, you won't regret it. Number 7. Ashley Bell, The Last Exorcism. When The Last Exorcism was first released in 2010, many immediately rubbished it as yet more found footage slop. And given how utterly unindated the subgenre was with low-effort fare at the time, it was easy to appreciate why. Despite this film is decidedly smarter than it at first seems, and benefits enormously from Ashley Bell's incredible central performance as Nell Sweetser, a naive farmer's daughter who appears to have become possessed by Satan. Bell's empathetic performance brings an effortless humanity to a part that's actually much tougher to play than it first seems, as the actress needs to keep the audience in the dark about the precise nature of her predicament until the end, not tipping her hat too far in either direction. It's also a tremendous physical performance, with Bell using her own hypermobility to perform most of the on-screen contortionism herself. Though Ashley Bell did receive an Independent Spirit Award nomination for Best Supporting Female, she's never really received the wider praise from the horror community for the role that she so thoroughly deserves. Number 6. Matt Dillon, The House That Jack Built. The sheer provocative extremity of Lars von Trier's The House That Jack Built ended up distracting from the fact that Matt Dillon gave a frankly Oscar-worthy performance as twisted serial killer Jack. While the film's unflinching, unsentimental brutality is understandably too much for many, Dillon hurls himself fearlessly into the part of a psychopath capable of committing the most heinous atrocities against human beings, adults and children alike. Few actors would want to go to such a dark place, especially with von Trier's treatment being so unapologetically graphic. But Dillon manages to take a character who is completely devoid of empathy and make him feel real, rather than the soulless, empty vessel he could potentially have become in lesser hands. Given how played out this type of role is in the horror genre, Matt Dillon impressively brings something fresh to it, while still presenting Jack as a realistic character who could conceivably exist in the real world, terrifyingly. Number 5. Isabel Fuhrman, Orphan. Easy though it is to dismiss Orphan as silly schlock considering the utterly ridiculous nature of its premise, it should be much tougher to wave away Isabel Fuhrman's tremendous performance as Esther, aka Lena. To be clear, Fuhrman, who was 11 years old at the time of shooting, was cast to play a 33-year-old woman who suffers from a hormone disorder that causes her to resemble a child, with clever makeup tricks being employed to make Fuhrman look older during the movie's post-reveal sequences. That's a wild concept for anyone to get their head around, let alone a child. And yet, Isabel Fuhrman is superbly convincing both as a sinister child and more malevolent, calculating adult. It's one hell of a juggling act for a child actor to pull off, and yet without it, the entire movie wouldn't work. In the pantheon of creepy kids in horror movies, Fuhrman's Esther deserves to be talked about with the best of them. Number 4. Ryan Reynolds, The Voices. Ryan Reynolds is of course best known for his blockbuster movie roles, namely Deadpool. Yet every so often he'll fling himself into something totally left field and unexpected. And in 2014, this was The Voices, a horror comedy in which he portrays a schizophrenic man, Jerry Hickfang, who hallucinates his pets talking to him and while off his medication becomes a killer. It isn't just that this is a totally wild swing of a role for Reynolds, but that he pulls multi-part duty here, also providing spirited voiceovers for 4 different talking animals throughout the movie. For as perfect as Ryan Reynolds is playing Deadpool, The Voices offers up the most daring and provocative testament to his talents as an actor. Unfortunately though, between the film's abrasive subject matter and how poorly it was distributed upon release, The Voices has largely fallen by the wayside. To Reynolds' credit, he singled The Voices out as one of his favourite films he's made as recently as 2020, while aptly adding that it, quote, never really got its day in court. Number 3. Ashley Judd, Bug. William Friedkin's Bug is an admittedly polarizing psychological horror film, albeit one that's absolutely worth watching for Ashley Judd's career-best performance. Judd plays Agnes White, a lonesome waitress who shacks up with a drifter in a dingy motel room which they come to believe is infested with bugs. The generally divisive nature of the film, adapted from Tracy Letts' play of the same name, meant that many simply never gave it or Judd's performance the time of day, despite the fact that she delivers an intense performance far beyond what many ever expected. It certainly helps that Judd's got an equally brilliant Michael Shannon to bounce off, but all the same, her work here remains one of the genre's most buoyant and powerful depictions of loneliness-induced mania. Given that Bug's 20th anniversary arrives next year, it's the perfect time for audiences to discover it for the first time and shower Judd with the belated praise she deserved back upon release. Number 2. Ted Levine, The Silence of the Lambs. In terms of brilliant horror movie performances overshadowed by their fellow cast members, there's simply no more egregious example than Ted Levine in The Silence of the Lambs. The lion's share of the buzz was perhaps understandably lent to Anthony Hopkins and Jodie Foster, but Levine is just as brilliant as deranged serial killer Buffalo Bill. It's an incredibly tricky part to play, and Levine does a magnificent job, enough that his lack of Oscar recognition alongside his co-stars is a total head-scratcher, especially in a year with a relatively soft Best Supporting Actor lineup. For as charming and seductive a psychopath as Hannibal may be, Bill is the other side of the coin without which the film doesn't fully work, and that's all down to Levine's sublime performance. Though Ted Levine's work in The Silence of the Lambs is getting a tad more recognition these days, it shouldn't have taken 3 decades. Number 1. Brad Dourif, The Exorcist III. The Exorcist III is too often lumped in with the other dud sequels and prequels in the franchise, but it's a strong movie that should be best remembered for both that infamous jump scare and Brad Dourif's mesmerizing performance as James Veneman, aka the Gemini Killer. Excellent though George C. Scott is as protagonist Lieutenant William F. Kinderman, it's Dourif who makes the deepest impression with his bestial, unrelentingly intense rendition of Gemini. Dourif has to chew through lengthy monologues and remains almost hypnotically captivating despite being restrained in a straitjacket the entire time, enough that some of the script's shakier elements can basically be forgiven. His facial expressions, physical movements, and vocal choices all add up to one of the most viscerally discomforting depictions of evil the genre has ever seen, even if the film's generally underrated nature means that Dourif's work too lacks the plaudits it deserves. Fascinatingly though, Fox didn't even want Brad Dourif in The Exorcist III at all, initially planning for original Exorcist star Jason Miller to play the part, rather than a mere cameo as Patient X, and it was only Miller's ailing health which prompted the pivot to Dourif.